The morning mist rolled gently off the pristine Montana lake, curling around the wooden dock where Garrett Holloway, stood with a steaming cup of coffee. This lake had been my family's refuge for 4 generations. A slice of heaven purchased by my grandfather in 1952, who built this dock with his own hands. I could still hear the crunch of frost underfoot on early mornings, the aroma of coffee blending with the pine-scented air, and the distant calls of loons echoing across the glassy water. Every summer, my late wife Sarah turned this quiet sanctuary into a hub of joy with the Memorial Bass Derby. What started with 15 families grew into a tradition, where kids caught their first fish, grandparents shared stories over coolers full of sandwiches, and the community felt connected in ways no HOA policy could ever quantify. From bankers' kids to mechanics' grandchildren, everyone felt welcome. I kept this tradition alive after Sarah passed, watching my 3 grown children bring their kids, the laughter spilling across the water just like it had 20 years ago. Life was peaceful, predictable, and full of memory. Yet there was an undercurrent of tension I couldn't ignore. New faces had started showing up in the neighborhood, strangers with an air of entitlement, the kind who saw land not as a home but as an asset to monetize. And among them was Viven Blackstone, who would soon challenge everything we had built. But for now, as the morning sun glinted off the lake, I took a deep breath, savoring the quiet, and reminded myself why this place mattered. Every cast, every ripple, every laugh carried Sarah's spirit, and I was determined to protect that legacy, come what may. Viven Blackstone
Thank you all for coming
arrived like
today.
a whirlwind.
Let's get started with the
Her designer heels
presentation.
clicking against the polished floor of the community center. At 52, she carried herself with the confidence of someone used to running boardrooms, her long blonde hair perfectly styled, and a tailored suit that screamed wealth and power. She had moved here from Seattle only months ago, yet already she acted as if she owned the place, as if generations of memories and traditions meant nothing. At the podium, she projected images of floating restaurants and upscale lake developments, outlining her vision for what she called sophisticated modernization of our waterfront. Her voice dripped with authority, dismissive of any concerns from longtime residents. She promised economic vitality, higher-class clientele, and a dining experience that would transform the lake. But beneath the gloss, there was an unsettling disregard for the people who had nurtured this community for decades. I sat quietly among the neighbors, a mix of black and white Americans spanning decades of age and experience, all of us feeling the weight of her ambition, pressing against the traditions we cherished. The air was thick with tension, the scent of coffee mingling with Viven's expensive perfume. Every word she spoke chipped away at the peaceful rhythm of our lake, at the rituals of summer mornings and family fishing trips that had defined our lives. I clenched my coffee mug, remembering the words of my grandfather and the smile of Sarah, knowing that standing by quietly was no longer an option. The calm before the storm was over, and the first sparks of conflict were already igniting in our beloved Montana community. Viven Blackstone arrived like a whirlwind, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor of the community center. At 52, she carried herself with the confidence of someone used to running boardrooms, her long blonde hair perfectly styled, and a tailored suit that screamed wealth and power. She had moved here from Seattle only months ago, yet already she acted as if she owned the place, as if generations of memories and traditions meant nothing. At the podium, she projected images of floating restaurants and upscale lake developments, outlining her vision for what she called sophisticated modernization of our waterfront. Her voice dripped with authority, dismissive of any concerns from longtime residents. She promised economic vitality, higher-class clientele, and a dining experience that would transform the lake. But beneath the gloss, there was an unsettling disregard for the people who had nurtured this community for decades. I sat quietly among the neighbors, a mix of black and white Americans spanning decades of age and experience, all of us feeling the weight of her ambition, pressing against the traditions we cherished. The air was thick with tension, the scent of coffee mingling with Viven's expensive perfume. Every word she spoke chipped away at the peaceful rhythm of our lake, at the rituals of summer mornings and family fishing trips that had defined our lives. I clenched my coffee mug, remembering the words of my grandfather and the smile of Sarah, knowing that standing by quietly was no longer an option. The calm before the storm was over, and the first sparks of conflict were already igniting in our beloved Montana community. I spent hours at the courthouse, poring over property surveys, environmental codes, and permit databases. Every page I turned revealed cracks in Viven Blackstone's so-called authority. She had rushed permits through without proper review, skipped environmental studies, and ignored legal requirements for commercial waterway structures. As a retired engineer, I knew how critical these oversights could become if properly leveraged. Meanwhile, Viven escalated her tactics. She filed complaints with the sheriff, claiming I had harassed her construction crews and even attempted to sway HOA members to fine me for opposing her project. Her confidence was impressive but dangerously arrogant. She assumed that wealth and city connections could override decades of law, tradition, and community knowledge. Word of her shortcuts spread quietly among neighbors. Betty Sterling mentioned inconsistencies in her financial disclosures at the last HOA meeting. Chuck Morrison, the Vietnam veteran running the local coffee shop, offered support, feeding local gossip and documentation to those willing to listen. Slowly, a network of concerned citizens began forming, ready to stand behind the truth. Black and white neighbors alike started asking questions, looking at the permits, the surveys, the signs she had posted, and wondering why their traditions and property rights were being ignored. Then came a moment of vindication. A state environmental inspector arrived, carefully reviewing the project and its missing permits. The machines ground to a halt. For a few golden hours, the lake quieted. Birds returned, loons called again across the mirrored surface, and the smell of pine replaced diesel. It wasn't victory, not yet, but the first sign that law and careful preparation could slow even the most determined intruder. I realized that knowledge, patience, and community support were the true weapons. The fight was no longer just about property lines. It was about preserving a legacy, protecting memories, and asserting that no outsider, regardless of wealth or ambition, could rewrite the rules that generations had honored. My eyes met those of neighbors quietly documenting everything. A silent agreement passed among us. We would not let this lake, this home, this heritage be hijacked. Friday afternoon arrived, and with it, the culmination of weeks of research, planning, and quiet coordination with neighbors. The steel and hydraulic gate stood ready, a silent sentinel protecting decades of heritage. Concrete ballards had been sunk with precision, motion-activated cameras installed, and smartphone controls tested until flawless. Each component was a promise that the lake would remain open to the community, and that Viven Blackstone's intrusion would be stopped without violence, but with absolute authority. Neighbors gathered, quietly supportive, holding notebooks, cameras, and ready to testify if needed. Betty Sterling, Chuck Morrison, and Tom Halverson stood beside me, their presence a reminder that this fight wasn't mine alone. Community solidarity lent the scene a palpable tension, a sense of righteousness infused with determination. Every face reflected decades of memories, traditions, and the stakes of family and public access to the lake. At exactly 5 o'clock, the first luxury vehicles arrived for Viven's Labor Day pre-opening. Drivers slammed brakes, stepped out in disbelief, and confronted the reality of the locked ramp. Phones rang, voices rose, confusion rippled across the water. A $100 dinner reservation suddenly meant nothing. And then she appeared, Viven, Tesla idling, designer heels crunching gravel, face flushing with panic and anger. She sprinted to the gate, yanking at hydraulic steel as though sheer will could overcome engineering. But the system was flawless. From my porch, coffee in hand, I watched the unraveling of her empire. The security cameras recorded every desperate attempt, every futile kick, every failed motion to bypass a system she had underestimated. It was mesmerizing, almost theatrical, the embodiment of hubris meeting precision planning. Her staff, stressed and underpaid, had started whispering doubts about the sustainability of this venture, while local citizens documented everything for the upcoming HOA meeting. For the first time in weeks, the lake felt like mine again. Not mine as in possession, but mine in the sense of restored stewardship, the preservation of memories, and the defense of community. Families could see that tradition, legality, and solidarity could stand against greed and short-sighted ambition. The stage was set, not for conflict, but for justice. By Thursday evening, the full weight of truth had caught up to Viven Blackstone. Evidence of embezzlement, bribery attempts, property trespass, and unpaid wages was presented at the largest HOA town hall in our community's history. Cameras rolled, neighbors murmured in disbelief, and the sense of decades-old injustice finally gave way to accountability. When Detective Morrison announced her arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and attempted bribery, the room erupted in a mixture of relief, satisfaction, and vindication. The next morning, the gate was removed. Families returned to the dock their grandparents had built. Children ran to cast their lines, and loons called across the mirrored surface of the lake. The smell of fresh pine replaced diesel and concrete. Our community had regained its rightful rhythm. Sarah's memorial base derby returned in full force, bigger than ever, with families from 3 states participating. Entry fees funded scholarships in her name, ensuring future generations could learn, fish, and honor tradition. I opened Sarah's bait and tackle in the old marina, a small, welcoming space where families could gather, share stories, and prepare for days on the lake. Chuck Morrison brought coffee, Betty Sterling baked cookies, and Tom Halverson's grandson caught his first base from the very dock. Sarah had loved. It was more than a reopening. It was a celebration of legacy, justice, and community resilience. Viven Blackstone's legal and financial recklessness had destroyed her own ambitions. Her restaurant platform was towed away, her husband filed for divorce, and criminal charges ensured she could never repeat this betrayal elsewhere. Local authorities praised our documentation and strategic approach, which had prevented the privatization of decades-old public access. The lake once again belonged to everyone who loved it. Families gathered for monthly lake cleanup days, teaching kids about water quality and conservation. The HOA dissolved into a neighborly cooperative, returning control to those who cared. Our story became a model for other communities facing similar challenges. Preparation, community solidarity, and legal knowledge can stop corruption and greed. As I stand on the dock, coffee in hand, watching children cast lines where their grandparents once did, I feel Sarah's presence in every joyful splash. The lake is quiet again, the way it should be, loons calling across the water, families laughing, and traditions restored. We fought for our heritage, our memories, and our neighbors, and in the end, justice and peace prevailed. Warrung.